Honkadori literally translates as taking from an original poem, but the standard formal English translation for this technique is allusive variation. If you remember, in the YouTube video I said that to some extent the history of waka is the history of a search by poets for ways to break out of the limitations imposed by the 5-7-5-7-7 syllable format and add greater depth and meaning to their work. Allusive variation is another one of the ways in which poets did this. As I mentioned earlier, when talking about diction, there were only a limited number of words which it was acceptable to use in a waka poem. It should come as no surprise to you then that, with so many poets composing so many poems, there were only so many possible combinations of these words, and thus it was to some extent inevitable that sooner or later poets would start repeating themselves. Thus, the same line, or even sequences of lines, may occur and reoccur in multiple poems. From about the 11th century, this became formalised as a poetic technique. That is, poets would deliberately include lines from earlier poems in their own work as a way of adding those poems' connotations and significance to the poems they were composing then. Brouwer and Miner described this as a complex neoclassicism, meaning a new use of classic material in a current work. But which poems should a poet draw upon for allusive variation? Could any previously composed waka be used? Broadly speaking, the answer to that is no, although there are some grey areas. For allusive variation, poets were generally only supposed to refer to poems which had been previously recognised as of good quality. As one measure of a poem's quality was whether it was included in an imperial anthology or not, this meant that the poems which were drawn upon for these purposes most frequently were these ones. Indeed, some critics considered that producing an allusive variation of a poem which was not included in an imperial anthology was a fault and an indication of a poorly constructed poem. The reason why these sorts of poems were prioritised for allusive variation should, I think, be obvious. It did a poet no good if they made an allusion to an earlier poem and no one recognised it. Thus, it was important that any poems chosen for allusive variation were well enough known that the poet could assume his or her audience would recognise the allusion and know the original poem. The largest set of poems which fitted into this category were those in the imperial anthologies, because they were held up as paragons and frequently memorised as part of a person's education in waka. But it was also possible to use poems from other particularly famous and well-known literary works. Probably the most famous of these, and the most frequently alluded to in various ways, was Murasaki Shikibu's 10th century masterpiece, Genji Monogatari, The Tale of Genji. But the situations and poems recounted in Ise Monogatari, The Tale of Ise, many of which also occur in imperial anthologies, were also used. Let's take a look at a couple of examples. Here's a poem on the topic of spring ice from the poetry contest in 600 rounds, which took place in 1193-94. Kori ishi mizu no shiranami tachi kaeri, harukaze shuruki, ike no omo kana. To the iced clear waters waves of white, return once more spring's breezes, how well they know this Mia's face. This poem is an allusive variation on an anonymous love poem from Kokinshu. Topic unknown. Ishima yuku mizu no shiranami tachi kaeri, kaku koso wa mime akazu mo aru kana. Flowing twixt the rocks, clear waters, waves of white, return once more. Even so would I see you, and never sated be by it. As you can see, the second and third lines of both poems are identical, but what does take as reference to the earlier poem add to his own? To understand that, we have to think about the sense and tone of the original work. This poem follows a very common structure, where a description of a scene in the natural world is presented as a preface to a statement about the poet's emotions. The poet pivots, this is another technique which I will talk about in due course, around the central line, with returning once more, applying equally to the waves described at the beginning of the poem and also to the male lover at the end. Courtly etiquette of the time mandated that a man had to leave his lady-love's side before dawn and return home. So the man is saying, even though I have to leave you and go home, the time we have spent together is not enough for me, and I want to see you again. The original poem is somewhat more erotic than the translation implies, because see, in the context of a relationship between a man and a woman, was a euphemism for having sexual intercourse. The poet has used the image of the waves at the beginning of the poem for two reasons. First, this image of the waves forcing themselves between a gap in the rocks emphasises the strengths of his passion. And second, waves are constant, and so he is implying to the lady that his feelings for her are as constant and eternal as the waves are. In writing his poem, Taker expects his audience to be aware of the original one and understand all of these images and connotations. By referring to it in a poem on the spring theme of spring ice, he draws a link between the breezes and the lover touching his lady, creating a sort of semi-personification without actually stating so explicitly. This is reinforced by the final reference to face, because in Heian society a man would only ever see a woman's face under the most intimate of circumstances, unless she was a close relative. The allusive variation, then, adds a complexity and depth to the images Taker uses, and thus enhances the reader's enjoyment of his work. Let's look at another example. This poem, on the topic of lengthening days, is an allusive variation on a love poem from Kokinshu by Ariwara no Narihira. Haru no hi wa nada no shiya no amabito mo ito mo arite ya kurashi waburan. In the springtime sun at Nada, the salt-making fisherfolk too have time to spare, and live with it heavy on their hands. Narihira's poem is Ashinoya no nada no shio yaki ito manami tsuge no gushi mo sasazu kinikeri. In her reed-roofed hut at Nada roasting salt, she has no time to spare. Not even with a boxwood comb within her hair does she come to me. This is a slightly different type of allusive variation, in that Ietaka has taken elements from Narihira's poem and incorporated them into his own, but again, the purpose is the same. To ensure that readers think of his work, think of the original poem when reading it, and see how the images and tone of that poem add to his own. Narihira's poem is part of a long tradition of poems by the court nobility, which used the images of fisherfolk as metaphors for erotic passion, or eroticised the fisherfolk themselves. The fisher girl in Narihira's poem has to work. She has little time for the niceties of feminine behaviour, like dressing her hair to make it look attractive. She's passionate and eager and takes an active role in lovemaking. Ietaka subverts this, to some extent, with his suggestion that Narihira has got it wrong. Fisherfolk have plenty of time on their hands because salt making is a pretty tedious business. Once you have lit the fires, as long as you keep them going, there's not much to do but wait until the water has evaporated, leaving the salt behind. So the idea that the fisherfolk have time to think of other things, have time on their hands, fits well with the topic of lengthening days, with its implication that one will have more time to do things. And what might one particular fisher girl be open to doing in her boredom? Why? Have a fling with a court aristocrat. By the time Ietaka was writing, Narihira had a reputation as a great lover, a man no woman could resist, but Ietaka is subtly mocking this reputation with his suggestion that the fisher girl may only have had an affair with him out of boredom, or maybe it's her boredom that has stoked her passion. So the allusive variation adds a knowing note of humour to Ietaka's poem, while tying it firmly into the web of prior cultural knowledge which cultured individuals were supposed to know. There are two other techniques which poets used which I want to mention just briefly. The first of these is called kakekotoba, which is generally translated as pivot word into English, although pivot expression might be more accurate. If you remember, I said that the Kokinshu poem which Taker alluded to earlier pivoted around the central line tachikaeri. This is an example of a kakekotoba. Essentially, this is a technique whereby an expression in a poem could have a dual meaning or apply in different ways to what came before and after it. It's thus a form of wordplay which was used by poets to add additional semantic content, meanings, to their works without having to add additional syllables and so break the pattern of the waka form. The final technique I want to mention is called engo, which translates as evocative language. This functioned in two ways in Waka poetry. First, as you might expect, poets would often use words from similar semantic fields, that's a fancy way of saying with related meanings, in their poems, in order to reinforce the senses that they wish to convey. So, in a poem on a particular pond, for example, it would not be surprising if you found the word water or the word rain as well. This sort of evocative language is relatively easy to replicate in English translation, and so it's something which you will be able to identify for yourselves. The second type of evocative language, however, is simultaneously more interesting and more difficult to detect, unless you are dealing with the poems in their original Japanese. Because of the language's limited phonetic inventory, it has an enormous number of homophones, that is, words which are pronounced the same, but which have different meanings. Clever poets would make a point of including these in their work as a way of setting up semantic echoes, hints and reminders to the reader to either trigger off new associations or reinforce existing ones. So, say you start your poem, Yuki no shita ni, beneath the snow. You might then continue it with ikeru kusaba wa, live the blades of grass. But the verb you have chosen for live, iku, which is in the form ikeru here, contains ike at its beginning, which is the word for pond. So you've managed to incorporate a reinforcing semanteme, element of meaning, into your poem. You then follow this with mizu keredo, I cannot see. But mizu is also the word for water, adding a further semantic element. Engo can be difficult to spot without careful and detailed study of a poem's original text, and just like pivot words, is often impossible to replicate in translation. And that's it for critical terms and techniques. I know I've given you quite a lot of information in this presentation, and it will take time for you to digest all of it. So take a nice break, think the content over. Of course, if you have any questions, then please ask me.